The sky over Germany in December 1943 was a freezing, unforgiving void. At 27,000 feet, the air is thin enough to starve the brain and cold enough to shatter steel. On this particular afternoon, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of cordite and the dying screams of heavy machinery. A B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Olde Pub, was struggling to maintain its place in the world. It didn't look like a weapon of war anymore. It looked like a ghost. Earlier that morning, the bomber had been part of a massive American formation targeted at the aircraft factories in Bremen, but the flak, the German anti-aircraft fire, had been devastating. One shell had detonated directly in the plexiglass nose, killing the lead navigator and wounding the bombardier. Another had torn through the fuselage, shredding the oxygen system and knocking out 2 of the 4 engines. The pilot, a 21-year-old second lieutenant named Charlie Brown, was fighting a losing battle with the controls. His tail gunner was dead, slumped over his twin .50 calibers. His waist gunners were unconscious from blood loss and lack of oxygen. The plane was a colander of jagged aluminum, its rudder nearly gone, its left wing weeping fuel into the slipstream. As the bomber fell behind the formation, drifting alone into the German heartland, it became the ultimate prize. For any Luftwaffe pilot, this was the simplest kill imaginable. It was a slow-moving, defenseless target that represented another notch on a pilot's tally and another step toward the Knight's Cross. High above, a silver streak dived out of the sun. It was a Messerschmitt Bf 109, and its pilot was already lining up the killing blow. The man in the cockpit of the Messerschmitt was not a novice. Franz Stiegler was a Luftwaffe ace, a veteran who had survived the burning sands of North Africa and the brutal dogfights over the Mediterranean. He had 22 kills to his name. One more, and he would earn the most prestigious medal in the German military. To Stiegler, war had become a mechanical process of survival and scorekeeping. He had seen his friends vanish in balls of fire over the desert. He had seen the charred remains of German cities. He knew exactly what victory looked like. It looked like a wreckage falling through the clouds. As he closed the distance, his thumb hovered over the gun trigger. He moved into the dead zone behind the B-17, expecting the tail guns to bark at him, but the barrels stayed silent. They were pointed at the earth, lifeless. Stiegler slowed his engine, matching the bomber's agonizingly slow pace. He was so close now that he could see the individual rivets in the American skin. He was waiting for a reason to fire, for a single defensive move that would justify the kill. But the bomber just hung there, vibrating with the rhythm of its failing engines, refusing to fall and unable to fly. Curiosity eventually overcame the hunter's instinct. Stiegler pulled his fighter alongside the waist of the B-17, and for the first time in his career, the war became intimate. Through the jagged, torn-open fuselage where the waist guns should have been, Stiegler saw inside the plane. He didn't see a strategic target, he saw a slaughterhouse. He saw American crewmen huddled together, trying to bandage wounds with frozen hands. He saw the frantic wide eyes of a young man, hardly older than a boy, struggling to keep his comrade from bleeding out on the floorboards. He saw the exposed interior of the plane, the wires hanging like veins, the blood smeared against the frozen metal. This wasn't combat anymore. It wasn't a duel between 2 machines. It was an execution. Stiegler felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He looked at Charlie Brown in the cockpit, a pilot who was staring straight ahead with a mask of pure, exhausted desperation. Brown was trying to fly a corpse. In that moment, a voice from the past echoed in Stiegler's mind. It was the voice of his first commanding officer in North Africa, Gustav Rodel. Rodel had once gathered his pilots before a mission and said, "You are fighter pilots, first, last, always. If I ever hear of one of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." To Rodel, and now to Stiegler, a crippled bomber with a wounded crew was no different than a man dangling from a silk canopy. It was a defenseless human being. Honor, even in a world consumed by madness, still mattered. Stiegler's finger moved away from the trigger. He realized that he couldn't kill these men. But he also knew that if he simply flew away, the German flak batteries on the coast would finish what he started, or another, less sentimental pilot would swoop in to claim the easy victory. Stiegler did something unthinkable. He pulled his measurement even closer, just feet away from the American's wingtip. He began gesturing wildly to Charlie Brown. He was trying to tell the American pilot to land. He pointed toward the ground, toward a German airfield. To Stiegler, this was the only way to save them. If they landed, they would become prisoners of war, but they would live. They would have doctors, food, and a chance to see their families again. But Charlie Brown, dazed and terrified, didn't understand. He looked at the German ace and saw a predator playing with its prey. He expected the cannon fire to start at any second. He shook his head and kept the nose of the pub pointed towards England. Stiegler changed his tactic. If they wouldn't land, he would have to escort them. He moved his fighter to the B-17's tail, shielding the bomber from the view of German ground crews. To the flak gunners on the coast, it looked like a German fighter was finishing off a kill. They held their fire, waiting for the final explosion. For 20 minutes, the most unlikely formation in the history of the Luftwaffe crossed the German border. A silver measurement Bf-109 and a shredded B-17 flying together in a silent pact of mercy. In the freezing cockpit of his measurement, Franz Stiegler felt the weight of the moment pressing down harder than the G-forces of a high-speed dive. He didn't just pull his fighter alongside the B-17, he tucked his fighter in so close that the turbulent air from the bomber's failing engines buffeted his wings. Through the scratched canopy of the measurement, Stiegler stared directly into the eyes of the American pilot. On the other side of that glass, 21-year-old Charlie Brown was paralyzed. To him, the German ace looked like the personification of death. He could see the yellow 0 painted on the side of the German fighter. He could see the oxygen mask pulled tight against the pilot's face. Brown waited for the inevitable, the flash of the 20mm cannons, the sudden disintegration of his cockpit, the final plunge into the North Sea. He told his co-pilot to prepare for the end. But the fire never came. Instead, Stiegler did the unthinkable. He became a shield. He knew that the German flak batteries on the coast were manned by crews who were trigger-happy and exhausted, trained to fire at anything with 4 engines. If they saw a lone mangled B-17, they would vaporize it. But if they saw a German fighter flying in tight formation with that bomber, they would hesitate. They assumed the German was either herding a prize or finishing a kill. For miles, the two enemies flew as one. The sleek, predatory lines of the Bf-109 contrasted sharply with the jagged skeletal remains of Ye Olde Pub. It was a formation that defied every manual of aerial warfare ever written. It was an escort born of a shared silent recognition that the men in the other cockpit were not just targets, but human beings trapped in the same terrifying physics of flight. As they neared the German coastline, the tension inside both aircraft reached a breaking point. Stiegler began gesturing wildly. He pointed toward the ground, his gloved hand chopping the air in a downward motion. He was trying to communicate a simple, desperate plan. Land, surrender, save your men. He knew that if the Americans tried to cross the open sea in a plane that was effectively a flying sieve, they would likely drown. To Stiegler, a prisoner of war camp was a paradise compared to a watery grave. He mouthed the word Sweden, a neutral territory just a short flight away where they could find safety. But Charlie Brown couldn't hear him over the roar of the 2 remaining Wright Cyclone engines. Dazed by blood loss and anoxia, Brown only saw an enemy pilot mocking him. He looked at his wounded crew, looked at the jagged horizon, and shook his head. He was going to try for England, or he was going to die trying. Seeing the Americans' resolve, Stiegler accepted the silent pact. He stayed with them until the coastline of occupied Europe faded into a thin, dark line behind them. He watched the B-17 struggle over the whitecaps of the North Sea, a wounded bird leaning on the wind. When they reached the edge of German-controlled airspace, Stiegler knew he could go no further. To stay any longer was to invite a court-martial or a friendly fire incident. He pulled his fighter level with Brown's cockpit one last time. There were no words. There was only a long, steady look between two men who had shared a moment of absolute truth in a world of lies. Stiegler peeled his measurement away in a sharp banking turn, disappearing back toward the continent, leaving the Americans alone with the ocean and their fate. When reports reached the Führer's bunker that the People's fighter was falling apart in midair, the reaction was not one of concern for the pilots, but of explosive, blind fury. However, Hitler's rage wasn't directed at the flawed engineering or the impossible deadlines. He was at war with reality itself. In the claustrophobic heat of the subterranean command center, Hitler demanded faster production. He viewed any suggestion of further testing as sabotage. Immediate deployment. He wanted hundreds of these jets in the air by the spring of 1945, regardless of whether the wings stayed on. No more delays. To Hitler, the laws of aerodynamics were secondary to the will of the German people. He refused to accept the fundamental truths that his engineers tried to whisper. He refused to hear that wood, especially wood bonded with acidic glue, could not mimic the structural integrity of high-grade aluminum. He refused to acknowledge that a 16-year-old boy, no matter how fanatical, could not master a temperamental jet engine in a single afternoon. To the Nazi leadership, desperation was a substitute for engineering. Under direct orders from the highest level of the Reich, the Heinkel 162 was cleared for service. It was a political decision made in a vacuum of logic, sentencing a new generation of pilots to fly a machine that was essentially a high-speed coffin. The most haunting chapter of the Volksjäger story began when the aircraft reached the newly formed People's units. The original plan, the fantasy that Hitler had clung to, was to fill these cockpits with teenagers from the Hitler Youth. These were children who had been raised on a diet of propaganda and basic glider training. Many had never touched a throttle. They had only known the silent, slow-motion world of unpowered flight. Now they were expected to take off in a jet, manage the complex startup and high-speed taxiing of a BMW 003 engine, fly at extreme speeds, control a sensitive, twitchy aircraft at velocities that even veteran aces found difficult to handle, intercept Allied bombers, engage in high-stakes combat against the combined might of the American and British air forces, land safely, navigate a high-speed landing on narrow, fragile landing gear that frequently collapsed upon contact. The reality was a slaughter. The training schools became graveyards. For every hour the HE-162 spent in combat, it spent 10 killing its own pilots in training accidents. The aircraft was so unstable that a single jerky movement on the control stick could cause the tail to snap or the wings to fail. By the time the units were considered combat-ready, there were few pilots left to fly them. The Volksjäger had achieved a grim distinction. It was the only aircraft in history to kill more of its own pilots through mechanical failure and design flaws than it ever lost to enemy fire. It was a miracle of technology, perhaps, but it was a nightmare of humanity, a weapon that turned its back on the very children it was supposed to save. History often remembers the HE-162 as a desperate failure, but to look only at its flaws is to miss the terrifying genius buried within its wooden frame. Despite the acidic glue and the rushed assembly lines, the aircraft was not a mere toy. In the hands of a skilled aerodynamicist, the Spatz was a glimpse into a future that Germany simply didn't live to see. On paper, the Sparrow was a formidable predator. It was blisteringly fast. Its top speed of over 560 miles per hour made it faster than almost anything in the Allied inventory. Even the legendary P-51 Mustang, the Cadillac of the sky, was left standing still when the Heinkel 162 engaged its turbojet. Hard to spot. Because of its diminutive size, barely 30 feet long, it was a ghost on the horizon. Allied bomber gunners often didn't see the tiny jet until it was already within firing range. Heavily armed, it packed two 20mm MG-15 cannons capable of shredding the heavy armor of a B-17 with a single well-aimed burst. The tragedy of the Heinkel 162 was one of lost potential. Had it been built with the high-quality alloys Germany possessed in 1941, had it been given a year of patient flight testing to iron out its stability issues, had it been flown by the veteran aces of the Battle of Britain, it could have been the most dangerous interceptor of the war. But by 1945, the variables had changed. Germany had no high-grade aluminum left. It had no time left. Most importantly, it had no veteran pilots left to harness the beast. The aircraft was a masterpiece of theory, executed in a world of rubble. As the war entered its final weeks, the wooden jet ceased to be a weapon of war and became a symbol of a dying regime. It was the physical manifestation of a government that had lost its grip on the physical laws of the universe. The Volksjager project was a mirror held up to the Third Reich, and the reflection was one of total, unraveling delusion. It was a program that systematically replaced the pillars of military success with the theater of desperation. It replaced planning with panic. Instead of long-term strategic goals, the RLM operated on 90-day cycles of miracle demands, chasing ghosts while their oil fields burned. It replaced training with propaganda. The regime told teenagers they were the new Aryan Knights, handing them a pamphlet on jet engines and expecting them to perform miracles that seasoned colonels could not achieve. It replaced engineering with orders. When the wings snapped off, the solution wasn't for the Führer to scream louder for more production. The Volksjager was never truly a people's fighter. It was a panic weapon. It was an admission that the traditional Luftwaffe had been annihilated, and all that remained was the hope that wood, glue, and the lives of children could somehow balance the scales against the industrial might of the world. It was a machine designed by geniuses but commanded by madmen, a jet fighter built with the logic of a suicide pact. When the British and American forces finally overran the airfields at Lech and the underground factories and the salt mines, they found hundreds of HE-162s in various states of completion. Some were missing engines, others were missing instruments, many were still being glued together by forced laborers who knew the war was already lost. The ultimate failure of the HE-162 was not that it was made of plywood. In fact, many successful aircraft, like the British de Havilland Mustang, used wood to great effect. The HE-162 failed because it arrived in a world that had already moved on. It failed because the war was already over before the first Sparrow ever took flight. It stands today as a haunting lesson in the limits of technology. No invention, no matter how revolutionary, no matter how much faster it flies or how hard it hits, can reverse the collapse of a nation when reality is ignored. A jet engine is a marvel of science, but it cannot fly on propaganda alone. It cannot stay aloft when the very airframe is being eaten by acidic glue born of a destroyed supply chain. Germany's wooden wonder proved one final brutal truth about the end of the Third Reich. When a regime reaches its breaking point, even its miracles are built from scraps. As the survivors of JG-1 surrendered their wooden jets to the Allies, they weren't just handing over airplanes, they were handing over the last physical evidence of a fantasy that had finally, mercifully, come to an end.